Netflix's Cyberpunk Edgerunners is an unexpected masterclass in what happens when a studio like Trigger is given the freedom to express their vision and provided source material in their own expressive and unrestrained sensibilities. The scope of Night City as a living, breathing place full of danger, love, abuse, and more than anything, an unrelenting torrent of corrosive bitterness at a world that has forsaken everything is at once as beautiful as it is magnificently sickening. The future is here, but it's not the future any of us hope for. Edgerunners ends like it begins, vibrant and sick, but the journey we take between episode 1 and 10 shows that amidst the horror and frenzy, beauty can exist even in the most tragic of circumstances. For those of you who haven't watched the series yet, do yourselves a favor and do so. You owe it to yourself not to be spoiled here. Or if you don't care, then hey, just be prepared. There are no good endings in Night City. David can be a difficult figure to talk about. It's hard to argue that the trouble he finds himself in isn't at some level self-inflicted. David begins his story railing against a society and hierarchical structure that rallies against him at every turn. He's an outsider in the eyes of his peers for coming from a non-affluent family outside of the circle jerk of corporate brutes that run the mega corporations that are in a constant arms race against one another. And because of his status as a student at an elite school, separates him from the impoverished majority that survive in the neighborhoods he lives in. He physically moves from these disparate segments of society, existing in both, but belonging truly to neither. The show goes to great lengths in episode 1 to show you this movement and David's place in moving between them. For a show that moves at a breakneck pace, it's unusual then that they would spend so much time here if they weren't trying to demonstrate this. Ultimately, David's a good kid. The decisions he makes, pushing petty drugs or getting illegal upgrades to his software, may make him outwardly look like any number of would-be future criminals, and certainly contributes to the negative view held of him by his classmates. But these choices, however questionable, are an attempt to help ease the burden his mom is enduring as she attempts to work by whatever means necessary to fund a bridge out of poverty for David. And when his mom ultimately meets her end at the hands of both ends of this maelstrom, the gangs and how they caused the traumatic car accident that ended her life and the rescue services that only cater to the mega rich, causes David to make a choice. One that sets him on a crash course with
in the sweet despair, I find something true that I like.
Lucy, like David and so many others, is a character who's been burned by the society she lives in. David spends much of his time in the early episodes of this series asking after Lucy, asking the gang he's joined, thanks to Lucy's involvement, about her past at every turn. That is to say that Lucy is reserved, she's careful, and not one to share much about her history, motivations, and dreams. However, it would be wrong to take this characterization of her and think that she's timid, because she's certainly not. She's fierce and highly skilled. She gets into fights with her team members and clearly enjoys pestering David as he assimilates into her world. It's the inner Lucy, her heart, that she hides from the world, growing up a product of the same mega corporations that she actively comes into conflict with, Arasaka. Her past is a fusion of her use as a tool to be used in mining lost data across the web and a deep willingness to survive using any means available to her. What's interesting is that David's fall from grace and acceptance of his new place in society drive him to adopt the Sandevistan that grants him the remarkable ability to move at several times the speed a human can ordinarily perceive time, making him nearly untouchable in fights and giving him extraordinary instinctual reflexes. The Sandevistan, not originally meant for David, becomes his mom's final parting gift and ultimately what brings him into Lucy's line of sight. Lucy's hinted at very early on, seemingly a blur, an outline, a suggestion of a person as she zips in and out of perception, pickpocketing Arasaka executives. David seems to be the only one capable of noticing her, and this is before even adopting the Sandevistan. This is great because it hints at David's natural perceptiveness and aptitude for Chrome and his extraordinary tolerance for tech that existed prior to his adoption for the Sandevistan. even though this Endeavistan is what reveals this incredible ability to everyone else, including Lucy. Lucy and David's early interaction then is one that shows their natural chemistry together, working as a team, and more importantly, their willingness to reveal themselves to one another. David through sharing his tragic situation with Lucy so openly and plainly, and Lucy less obviously sharing her dream to travel to the moon. Let's talk about this for a moment, Lucy's dream. Taken at face value, the moon seems to be an extraordinary goal in and of itself, in the same way that one might climb Everest or seek out the remote and extraordinary for an adventure. The idea of going somewhere you'd never been before, it's exhilarating, and David's childlike exuberance as he floats around in the moon simulation that Lucy shares with him is likely how most of us would approach a trip to the moon. But something about Lucy strikes me as not really holding this dream in the same way. Instead, I think the moon represents freedom and an escape from Night City and the world at large. We learn later, and we touched on earlier, that Lucy's been running her entire life. Her childhood was defined by being enslaved by a corporation, with her life being that of an expendable pawn in a corporate game of chess. And her life afterwards has been one of an edgerunner, living on the periphery of society where death and violence have always been knocking at her door. Given that context, the moon is more of an idea of escapism than an actual location to visit. Likely given the choice to leave Night City and start her life anew, this would more than satiate this goal, particularly with her newfound interest in David, and with David's infatuation with her. To one another, each represents hope for a better future, one free from the pain they both feel and have felt for a lifetime. But they are both kids, and tragically, as the relationship deepens, remain unable to see what each other truly need from the other. But we'll get more into that later.
I want this fused here. High time I chrome the fuck up.
Lucy introduces David to the life of an edgerunner by bringing him into contact with Maine and his crew, made up of Rebecca, Pillar, Dorio, Kiwi, and Falco, and of course Lucy. Each of these characters are instrumental in rescuing David from the complacency and self-destructiveness that would have befallen him had he remained alone, and serve as a haphazard replacement for his broken family. David's mom, Gloria, had a relationship with this group, and while the specifics and intensity of this relationship isn't made perfectly clear, it is clear that Maine, out of respect for Gloria and her memory, offered to take David in so long as he carries his own weight. Perhaps ironically, the very world that Gloria sought to hide from David is the world most willing to accept his existence. Not without its difficulty at first, David soon comes to be swallowed up into their world, and they too become enamored with David. Maine takes on a fatherly role with David, coaching him through what it means to be an edgerunner, shooting immunoblockers out in the afternoon sun, talking about girls and getting laid, or just how cool Maine's latest weapon is. Maine takes on a role that David didn't have before losing his mom, and Maine and his beliefs impact David's own beliefs on what it means to have a family and what being an edgerunner means, perhaps more than anyone else, even parroting Maine's own worlds when he later comes into his own. Rebecca and Pillar take on a brotherly and sisterly role, with Rebecca pursuing David as a one-sided love interest, and later on, right-hand man. Dorio, while not exactly motherly, does act as the voice of reason and calm when a situation gets too hot. Kiwi is the team's resident netrunner who balances her role with Lucy, also a netrunner, as their job is highly intensive and specialized, and Falco has a cool name and drives the car. There's a million things that can be said about each of these team members and their specific role in the story, and more specifically their impact on David. But for now, it's fair to say that the family they come to represent is ultimately what shapes David's outlook on the city, his relationships, both romantic and platonic, as well as his relationship with himself, his past, and his future. So what happens when the future once again begins to slip, when the family you had and the family you made both come to an end? The tragedy of David's story is really a story that is being repeated over and over again throughout Night City. It's a story of loving and losing, a story of struggling and failing, a tale of broken people and promises, all trying to just keep the tape from peeling off the walls. David begins to lose his family members to the same violence that percolates every corner of Night City. No matter the chrome they equip or the extra steps they take to run a job effectively, the business David deals in is one of blood. So though deeply saddening, the illusion that they could keep running in the sun forever is just that, an illusion. and when the glass breaks, starting with Pillar and culminating in the tragedy of Dorio and Maine, no one should really be surprised, though still absolutely, breathtakingly sad. Maine's death in particular hits David unlike any other. In Maine and Dorio's relationship, David sees one possible future for him and Lucy, running a team together while being a couple that leans on each other and builds a family of broken people just like them. But more than that, David loses a layer of protection that up until now was insulating him from the world. Sure, David ran these missions with Maine, Lucy, and the crew, but until the time skip, most encounters with rival Edgerunners, police, and Arasaka cronies ended with Maine stepping in, saving David from his own inexperience. Maine tells David early on, "There's no one in this world you can trust more than yourself. Don't use us as crutches or you'll die," suggesting that relationships are an easy way to end up hurt, and the only one you can really have watching your back is you. Kiwi reinforces this statement later on, and while the show's zeitgeist is certainly not that selfish self-preservation is the way to live your life, in fact the show goes through great lengths to demonstrate the opposite, think David and Lucy, it is clear that this is what people tell themselves, and that this belief is used to keep emotions in your heart from being too damaged by the brutality of the world, and serves as a simple excuse when the relationships you do have end up aiding in your own demise. This wonderful, terrible duality is present at all levels. The Edgerunners cling to each other and live and die by each other's own shortcomings, failures, and betrayals. This transformation in thinking is best represented in David's own physical body, both before and after the time skip. While David is insulated against the world, first by his mom and later by Maine and the crew, David's literal, fleshy heart and mostly unaugmented body stand in stark contrast to the rest of the crew, and especially Maine's own heavily altered body. David's humanity and his earnestness and ability to reconcile a world that has torn his life apart is due to the external protection around him and his own untarnished, youthful hopefulness. He can choose to remain without Chrome, without giving up his physical humanity for as long as he does, because those around him have already made the literal leap into full body augmentation and can, at their own expense, protect David until they no longer can. Once Dorio and Maine pass in episode 6, the time jump shows that David, in the absence of the group's physical shields in Maine and Dorio, has altered his body substantially in order to come to terms with his first true run-in with the world, in the absence of a safety net, and realization that to protect and be protected, he must become his own champion. David takes on the role of protector and leader in the vacuum that is left over, and the physical change in his body shows this quite literally. This jump furthermore illustrates the death of his own innocence and hints for the first time that David's psyche may not be the impenetrable shield that he once thought it was. David is physically stronger, yes, but he's also lost his biological family, most of his adopted family, and his love interest Lucy has been distant in the time since learning about Arasaka's interest in David. These psychological weights are likely the main cause of David's own ever-increasingly dangerous bouts of cyberpsychosis. While David has proven to be near invulnerable to its effects while his heart and mind are healthy, it's only when these two things are corrupted do the effects of the physical implants begin to take hold. In the end, the more David has to carry the weight of his own team and rely more or less solely on himself, the sooner and more dramatically does he begin to deteriorate. The final act of the anime shows David up against the full force of Faraday's scheming, Arasaka's plan to have him test a potentially mind-breaking superweapon, the hired military of Arasaka's rival corporation Militech, Kiwi's betrayal, Lucy's capture, and his own battle to remain sane amidst it all. In the time leading up to the final battle, we learn that David has made an impressive name for himself in adopting Maine's mantle and carrying on his code of ethics as an Edgerunner, quickly gaining notoriety and fame amongst the denizens of Night City. Lucy says as much, but it's worth revisiting here. David is a vessel for others' dreams, whether they be his mom's, Maine's, or Lucy's, and defines his own actions as if acting them out on behalf of others, to carry their will forward. And while noble, this is a deeply sad purpose, devoid of room for David's own aspirations or personal wants. Even Lucy, the object of his desire, remains a frustratingly distant goal despite them living together and maintaining an intimate relationship. The intimacy they do share has been complicated since Maine's death, as they both seek to protect the other in the absence of the group's cohesion. However, in their own childish way, they protect the other by remaining emotionally distant and uncommunicative in their feelings and struggles. Lucy won't participate in missions with David, with the secret purpose that she's attempting to erase Arasaka data and the deep web that links David to the Arasaka superweapon, and while David is away, assassinates Arasaka execs or others who may have this knowledge. By pursuing these ends in secret, she's keeping David off Arasaka's radar, but has the adverse effect of contributing to David's own loss of self. He empathizes with her desire to not participate in missions and won't force her out of love and respect for her, but her unwillingness to participate in his life and in his new makeshift family hurts David and further drives him to adopt more Chrome as he takes on more burden of his own. This isn't to make Lucy sound like a bad person, because she's not. David is just as guilty of being unable to vocalize his needs to Lucy and not taking a more active role in helping her through whatever he assumes her roadblock to be. David thinks she needs more time to recover from the events of episode 6, but what she really needs is David, and David likewise needs her. Again, revisiting Lucy's dream of the moon, when David recalls this to Lucy, she's surprised that he remembers, but the conversation ends there. Lucy could tell David that she just wants to get out of Night City with him and escape the horrors of life here, and David could tell Lucy that he's edge running and continuing on his path to maintain some semblance of family and purpose with her. But I don't believe that Lucy or David even realize this themselves, and so the red flags that the audience see going off all around them goes completely unrealized. That is, until the very final scenes of the show. But we'll get to that. David ultimately adopts the cyberskeleton superweapon to save Rebecca and Falco, with the plan to use the weapon to also rescue Lucy from Faraday and Arasaka's scheming. The weapon is immensely powerful, and even David's own natural resilience does little to hold back its effects, causing David to down immunoblocker after immunoblocker to simply buy himself enough time to get to Lucy. This one-way trip to oblivion is the only remaining path for David, and along the way, his last desperate goal to free Lucy of her chains, both physically and metaphorically. The final showdown starts at the highest point of the city, at the top of the Arasaka building. David recalls his mom's dream and remarks that in some form, he did make it to the proverbial top of Night City, though not in the same way his mom imagined. David's version, though sad and fleeting, represents the literal peak of the world that he knows, an edgerunner who has eclipsed all others, towering over the city that has taken his family and friends from him. He's, in a way, spitting in the face of Arasaka, other rival edgerunners, and Night City as a whole. For a brief moment, David has eclipsed it all, untouchable in the same way that Maine hoped to be, before plummeting back into the city from its greatest peak to its glowing central hub with Lucy in hand, before being crushed deeper into the slums of Night City by the boot of Atom Smasher. In a way, this sequence is the same as the sequence at the beginning of the show, this time instead of descending through the city rather than climbing up to meet it. The difference this time, other than the direction, is the purpose behind it, with David initially seeking to assimilate into and rise through the city ranks for the sake of Gloria's dream, and this time making the purposeful decision of his own volition to descend through it, for the first time to accomplish his own dream, which ultimately is to give Lucy the opportunity and choice to accomplish her own. Atom Smasher then, more so than being a semi-random villain introduced at the end of the show, represents the ethos of the city as a whole in several interesting ways. He's the literal manifestation of technology taken to its furthest extreme, a human who has allowed himself to become a machine for the sake of corporate greed and power, who has, unlike David, Maine, or anyone else we've met thus far, willingly tossed away his humanity for power and status, making incarnate the warning Maine and Kiwi both expressed early on, that the only one you can trust in Night City is yourself, existing to oppress those who would attempt to subvert it, and ultimately, in his confrontation with David, challenges David's own conclusions about the city and identity as an edgerunner. While David is weak compared to the might of the city as a whole, David's struggle against this monolith of corporate desire is what defines him. His persistent hard-headedness at believing, however naively, that a life, a family, and love can bloom here in a city sick with corruption is the same dream as every Edgerunner and citizen of the city. David then represents the struggle of the everyman, and when offered the choice to become a construct, a life eternal but perpetually enslaved to Arasaka, David succinctly defines where he stands.
Whatever, Choom. Like I give a shit.
Oh, well.
In the final moments of the series, sometime later, Lucy has made it to the moon thanks to David and Rebecca's sacrifice. She's made the journey she had dreamed about for so long and is the furthest from Night City she could possibly reach. And as she wanders alone across the lunar landscape, she remembers David.
Whoa, check this! I can feel the sun!
In this moment, she sees David in his youthful exuberance, the David she met on her first day out together. The David that was free of the burdens of being an Edgerunner, the David that she loved, and the David that ultimately rescued her. David dies a legend, but is remembered for all the qualities that made him human. And in the final seconds of the show, the music dies down, and Lucy turns to the sun, feeling its warmth, her hands reaching outwards, feeling David's embrace once again.
So what can